For as long as I can remember, my stepfather had a favorite phrase: "You'll never amount to anything." It wasn't a joke. It was a sentence he handed down every time I tried to do something with my life. I learned to keep my achievements quiet, to survive the constant drip of criticism. Years later, when I heard about a job opening, the kind of position he'd been chasing for months, I applied without telling him. What happened after I got the offer still echoes through every family gathering to this day. Growing up under the same roof as my stepfather meant living in a house where every accomplishment came with a footnote. If I brought home an A from school, he'd say, "Well, it's just one test." If I got picked for the varsity team, he'd point out that the season hadn't even started yet. It was never about celebrating. It was about reminding me that, in his eyes, I was perpetually falling short. I think the most dangerous thing about that kind of environment is how quietly it rewires your brain. You stop chasing things because you want them and start chasing them just to prove someone wrong, even if it means you never get the recognition you deserve. My mom would tell me not to take it personally. "That's just the way he talks," she'd say, like his sarcasm was some kind of regional dialect. But the truth was, he saved that particular brand of belittling for me. His own son, my stepbrother, could spill coffee on the couch and he'd laugh it off. If I so much as looked at the couch wrong, I'd get a lecture about respect and responsibility. By the time I turned 23, I'd perfected the art of staying out of his line of sight. We lived in the same town, but my visits to my mom's house were short and carefully timed to avoid his schedule. I had my own apartment, a job that barely paid the bills, and a quiet understanding with myself that I would never ask him for help. Then, one night at my mom's kitchen table, I overheard him talking to my uncle about a position opening up at a prestigious local firm. It was a role with great pay, benefits, and, most importantly, prestige. The kind of job he'd been chasing for years, the kind he bragged about to anyone who'd listen. His voice had this edge of longing, like he could already see himself behind that desk. Something in me shifted. For years, I'd swallowed his insults, let them roll off me, told myself they didn't matter. But hearing him talk about that job, knowing I had the qualifications, knowing I could get it, lit a fuse I didn't even realize was there. I didn't say a word to either of them. I just went home, polished my resume, and sent in my application. The thought of him finding out after the fact was almost sweeter than the possibility of landing the role. Almost. Little did I know, that single click of the submit button was about to set off a chain of events that would change not just my career, but the way my entire family saw me, and him, forever. The email came in on a Wednesday morning. I was halfway through a reheated cup of coffee, staring at a spreadsheet I didn't care about, when my phone buzzed. The subject line read, "Congratulations, you're moving forward." I clicked it open, trying to keep my expectations in check. It was the HR manager from the firm my stepfather had been talking about. They wanted me to come in for an interview the following Tuesday. My pulse kicked up. Not only had I made it past the first cut, but they were moving fast, the kind of fast that meant they were serious. I sat back in my chair, grinning to myself. I thought about calling my mom, telling her I'd gotten an interview. But then I pictured the conversation traveling through her, straight into his ears. He'd have time to prepare his defense, or worse, try to undermine me before I even walked into the building. No, this was mine. That evening, I stopped by my mom's house under the pretense of dropping off some mail that had been sent to my old address. He was there, sitting in his usual spot at the head of the kitchen table, leaning back like the chair was his throne. "Still working that dead-end job?" he asked, not even bothering to look up from his phone. I set the envelope down on the counter. "Still chasing that dream job?" I replied, my tone light enough to pass as banter, but sharp enough to make him lift his head. His eyes narrowed. "You wouldn't last a week in that place," he said. "Takes real experience, not whatever it is you think you have." I smiled, but didn't answer. Inside, I felt a small, satisfying spark. It was the first time in years I hadn't tried to defend myself. I just let the silence hang there until he broke it. "What?" he asked, shifting in his seat. "You applying or something?" I shrugged. "Just curious about it." He smirked, the kind of smirk that says I've already won this argument. "Don't waste your time." Then he went back to scrolling, dismissing me like background noise. What I didn't tell him was that, at that exact moment, my interview outfit was already hanging in my closet, dry cleaned and ready. I had my talking points rehearsed, my references briefed, and my portfolio printed in a neat black binder. Over the next few days, I avoided him completely. I drove a different route to work, ignored family group texts, and spent my lunch breaks practicing interview questions in the mirror. Every time I imagined his face when he found out, my motivation doubled. The interview itself was a blur, not because it went badly, but because it felt almost too easy. They liked my work, asked about my ideas for the department, and smiled in that way people do when they've already made their decision. I left the building certain I'd nailed it. 3 days later, the offer letter hit my inbox. My starting date was set for 2 weeks out. And, in a twist of perfect irony, it turned out my first day would be the same week my stepfather had been scheduled to interview for the exact same position. I didn't plan it that way. But when I realized the timing, I knew one thing for certain. There was no way I was going to tell him in advance. Because watching him find out in real time, that was going to be better than any paycheck. But I had no idea he'd find out in front of the one person whose opinion mattered to him more than anything. It started with a phone call I wasn't supposed to hear. I'd stopped by my mom's place to return a slow cooker she'd lent me, the kind of errand I normally scheduled for when my stepfather wasn't home. But as I stepped onto the porch, I heard his voice coming from the open kitchen window. "Wait, what do you mean the position's filled?" he was saying, his tone sharp, almost incredulous. A pause. Then, "No, I never got the email for an interview. That doesn't make sense. I've been networking with their people for months." I froze just outside the door. My hand hovered over the knob, heart thudding in my chest. There was another pause on his end, and then he added, "Yeah, I know who runs that department. They would have told me if someone else got it." Someone else. My stomach tightened. He didn't know yet, but he was circling the truth. I took a step back, suddenly hyper-aware of the creak in the porch boards, the sound my shoes made against them. If he saw me right now, my face would give me away. I needed to stay invisible, at least until the timing was right. When I finally knocked, I did it loud enough to announce my presence, giving him a few seconds to hang up. He opened the door wearing that same tight-lipped smile he used when he was irritated but didn't want to show it. "Hey," I said casually, holding up the slow cooker. "Returning this before I forget." He took it, set it on the counter, and leaned against the doorframe. "So, you working anywhere new these days?" The question was so loaded it almost made me laugh. "Same place for now," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "Why?" He shrugged, but his eyes stayed locked on me. "Heard there's been some movement at that firm downtown. Big job opening." Or there was. I felt the air between us shift. Heavy, almost tangible. He was fishing, but I wasn't going to bite. "Oh yeah," I said. "Didn't hear about it." His jaw twitched. "You'd think someone in your field would know about these things." The rest of the visit was a performance. We talked about the weather, my mom's garden, my stepbrother's new car. But under every sentence was an unspoken question. "Did you take it?" And under every answer, my unspoken response. "You'll find out soon enough." That night, I lay in bed replaying the conversation. Part of me felt a flicker of guilt, not because I'd done anything wrong, but because I knew this was going to hit him harder than anything I'd ever done. Another part of me, the bigger part, felt a rush of vindication. For once, I was ahead of him. For once, he didn't have the upper hand. 3 days later, my mom invited me to a Sunday family lunch. Normally, I'd find an excuse to skip it, but something told me this was the moment. I didn't have to reveal anything. I just had to be there. When I walked in, he was already seated at the table, chatting with my uncle. The conversation stopped for a fraction of a second when I sat down. I could feel his eyes on me, like he was waiting for me to slip. Then my uncle said something that made him go still, his fork frozen halfway to his mouth. And just like that, the truth about who got the job was out, but not from me. It happened so fast I barely had time to process it. 1 minute we were passing dishes around the table, and the next my uncle, completely oblivious to the tension between us, said, "Hey, congrats on the new job, by the way. That's the firm Greg's been chasing forever, right?" The sound of my stepfather's fork hitting his plate was sharper than it should have been. He didn't look at my uncle. He didn't look at my mom. He looked straight at me. I felt the weight of his stare, heavy, hot, almost physical. "What job?" he asked, his voice tight. I took a sip of water, giving myself a moment. "Oh, that one downtown," I said, keeping my tone light. "They made me an offer last week." For a second, I thought he might actually laugh it off. But then his face changed, not in a big, dramatic way, but in this subtle, dangerous tightening around his eyes. "You mean the—" He stopped himself mid-sentence, glancing at my mom, then back to me. That's the position I was supposed to interview for. I raised my eyebrows. Oh, I didn't know. Which was technically true. I hadn't known until after I got the offer. His knuckles whitened around his fork. You knew I was after that job. I leaned back in my chair, feigning confusion. I didn't know you owned it. The silence that followed was almost theatrical. My mom's hand hovered in the air, halfway to pouring iced tea. My stepbrother stared down at his plate like the mashed potatoes might offer him an escape route. You think this is funny? He asked finally, his voice low. No, I said. I think it's ironic. For years you've told me I'd never amount to anything. And now, well, here we are. His chair scraped loudly against the tile as he pushed back from the table. You think you've won something here? That job is way over your head. You'll fail, and when you do, they'll wish they'd hired me instead. I met his glare without flinching. Maybe. Or maybe they'll be too busy noticing how much better I am at it than you would have been. It was a gamble, saying that in front of everyone. But part of me wanted them all to hear it. My mom, my uncle, my stepbrother. Because for once, I wasn't going to let him control the narrative. He stood there for a long moment, like he couldn't decide whether to storm out or keep swinging. Finally, he muttered something under his breath and walked out of the room. The sound of the back door slamming echoed through the house. I kept eating, my appetite intact. It wasn't about the food. It was about the quiet satisfaction of knowing I'd just landed a blow he wasn't going to recover from quickly. Of course, I didn't realize at the time that this was just round one. Because a man like my stepfather, he doesn't take humiliation lying down. He comes back swinging, even if it means dragging everyone else into the fight. And his first move in that fight caught me completely off guard. I thought the kitchen confrontation would be the end of it, that he'd stew in his pride for a while, maybe make a few snide comments at the next family gathering, and then move on. I underestimated him. A week before my start date, I got a call from the HR manager at the firm. Her tone was polite, but strangely formal. We just have a few follow-up questions before your onboarding, she said. Nothing unusual about that, except the questions weren't about my resume or my experience. They were about my reputation. Has there ever been an issue with your work ethic? She asked. I laughed, thinking it was some kind of HR icebreaker. No, never. A pause. Any interpersonal conflicts in past positions? By the third question, would anyone have reason to doubt your leadership skills? The hairs on the back of my neck were standing up. After we hung up, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been whispering in her ear. The problem was, I didn't have proof. Not yet. That evening, my mom called. So, she began, her voice too bright. I heard your stepfather ran into someone from the firm today. I went still. From the firm? Yeah, she said. One of the senior partners. They're friends from some community board thing. He mentioned your name came up. It didn't take a genius to put it together. My stepfather, with his ego bruised and his connections ready to weaponize, had gone out of his way to find someone with influence over my new job. And judging by the HR questions, he'd wasted no time planting seeds of doubt. I wanted to confront him right then, but I also knew walking into his trap would be exactly what he wanted. Instead, I decided to listen. People like him can't resist talking about their schemes when they think they've won. 2 days later, I got my chance. I dropped by my mom's to help fix a leaky faucet. He was in the living room, laughing with one of his buddies over the phone. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, not at first. But then I heard him say my name. He's in way over his head, my stepfather was saying. Better they hear it now than after he screws something up. I'm doing them a favor. His friend must have asked something, because he chuckled. Oh, they'll still hire him. But the first time he slips, they'll know I warned them. And when that happens, guess who they'll call to replace him? I stood there in the hallway, gripping the wrench so tightly my knuckles ached. It wasn't just about the job anymore. He was laying the groundwork for my failure before I'd even set foot in the building. And the worst part? If I didn't play this right, he might actually pull it off. That night, I sat at my kitchen table until 2 a.m., going over every possible move. I could confront him publicly, try to get him to admit what he'd done in front of witnesses. Or I could outplay him quietly, making sure he had no room to twist the story. I didn't know which would hurt him more. But the opportunity to decide came sooner than I expected, and in a room full of people who'd been waiting years to see him humbled. The rest of that week felt like walking a tightrope with no net. Every time my phone buzzed, I half expected it to be the firm rescinding the offer. Every time my mom texted, I braced myself for some casual update, That was really just my stepfather's way of checking my pulse from a distance. The thing is, I've never been good at letting things slide. I can put on a calm face. I can even play dumb when it serves me. But underneath it all, I'm a strategist. And in this case, I knew I couldn't just react. If I wanted to win, really win, I had to make sure the win was undeniable. But that meant waiting. And waiting was the part that gnawed at me. At night, lying in bed, my mind kept running scenarios. One moment, I imagined confronting him in front of the whole family, forcing him to admit that he'd tried to sabotage me. In another, I pictured showing up at my new office and crushing it so thoroughly that his little rumor campaign would collapse under its own stupidity. The first option promised instant satisfaction, a verbal knockout punch. But it also meant giving him a chance to twist the narrative. See? He's unstable. He can't handle pressure. The second option was safer, but slower. And I wasn't sure I had the patience to let him take shots at me while I quietly built my defense. Midweek, I met up with my friend Daniel for coffee. He's one of those people who can read my mood before I even order. Okay, he said, leaning forward. Who pissed you off this time? I told him everything. The job, the sabotage, the overheard phone call. He listened without interrupting, but I could see the muscle in his jaw twitching. So he's trying to set you up to fail, Daniel said finally. Fine. Set him up to fail first. It was the kind of advice that sounded simple in theory, but in practice, tricky. How? I asked. Information, he said. You need proof. Not just that he's talking, but what he's saying and who he's saying it to. Once you have that, you control the story. That night, I dug out an old voice recorder I used back in college for interviews. It still worked. I didn't know exactly how or when I'd use it, but having it in my bag felt like a loaded weapon I could pull at the right moment. The other half of the plan was purely tactical. Walk into that job and exceed every expectation from day one. If my work was bulletproof, his narrative would have nothing to cling to. Still, a voice in the back of my head whispered, he's not going to stop just because you do well. He's going to escalate. I couldn't decide if that thought scared me or excited me, because the more he pushed, the more room I had to push back. And part of me was already craving the moment he realized his usual tricks weren't going to work on me anymore. By the time Sunday rolled around, I was ready for whatever came next. Or at least, I thought I was. Because the next move he made wasn't just about the job. It was about dragging my name through the mud in front of the one audience I couldn't afford to lose. Sunday lunch felt different this time. Maybe it was the voice recorder in my jacket pocket. Maybe it was the quiet satisfaction of knowing I'd already started working behind the scenes. Or maybe it was the fact that I'd finally stopped playing defense. When I walked into my mom's kitchen, my stepfather was leaning against the counter, coffee in hand, talking to my uncle. He didn't look at me right away, but when he did, his expression was pure calculation, the kind of look that said he was already running whatever game he'd planned for the day. I beat him to the punch. Hey, you know that firm downtown? I said casually, just loud enough for my uncle to hear. Had my first onboarding meeting on Friday. Everything's moving ahead fast. It wasn't a full reveal, but it was enough to plant a different kind of seed. One that said I'm already in, and there's nothing you can do about it. His smile didn't falter, but the way he set down his coffee cup a little too hard told me I'd scored a point. Hope you're ready for the pressure, he said. That place chews people up. I smiled back. Good thing I'm not people. Over lunch, I steered the conversation toward harmless topics. My mom's new garden project, my cousin's recent move. But I kept an ear out, waiting for him to slip into his usual passive-aggressive commentary. And sure enough, when the topic drifted to workplace politics, he bit. Some people, he said, looking directly at me, don't realize how quickly a bad reputation can spread. One wrong move, and everyone knows. I tilted my head, as if considering his point. That's true, I said. But you know what's interesting? These days, companies keep pretty thorough records of who says what. It's amazing what you can trace back if you really want to. It was subtle, but I saw it. That fraction of a second freeze before he picked up his fork again. He didn't say anything else on the subject for the rest of the meal. Driving home, I felt lighter. It wasn't victory, not yet, but it was control. For the first time since this started, I wasn't just reacting, I was dictating the tempo. That week, I threw myself into preparing for my first day. I researched the firm's clients, drafted ideas for streamlining their workflows, and even mapped out a few long-term strategies I could present in my first month. If I was going to survive his sabotage, I needed to be unshakable in the actual job. By Friday, I was convinced I'd turned the tide. And that's when the email arrived. It was from a senior partner, not the one who'd hired me, but someone high enough in the hierarchy to make me pay attention. The subject line was bland, follow up before start date. But the body of the message was a landmine. Before we proceed, it read, I'd like to address some concerns that have been brought to my attention regarding your professional conduct in past roles. Can we set a time to discuss? My first thought was confusion. I'd never had a black mark on my record. My second was rage. I didn't need a detective to tell me where these concerns had originated. And when I found out exactly what he'd told them, I realized this wasn't just sabotage, it was character assassination. The concerns turned out to be worse than I imagined. When I called the senior partner for clarification, I expected something vague, maybe a comment about inexperience or an implication that I wasn't a team player. Instead, she read directly from the notes she'd received. Multiple colleagues have expressed that my name has a pattern of taking credit for other people's work and creating a hostile work environment. One former manager described his attitude as entitled and manipulative. It was surreal, like hearing someone read a character profile of a stranger, except that stranger was supposed to be me. I swallowed hard. That's not true. None of it. The partner's voice stayed even. I'm not saying I believe it. But in our line of work, perception matters. I wanted to hear your side directly before you start. We agreed to meet the next morning. As soon as the call ended, I just sat there, staring at the wall. This wasn't just a petty jab anymore. This was a calculated attempt to poison the well before I even had a chance to drink from it. The only person who could pull something like this together so fast and make it sound convincing was my stepfather. And he hadn't just thrown mud. He'd made sure it stuck to the places that mattered most. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the phone calls I'd overheard, the pointed comments at family dinners, the way he'd smiled when he thought I didn't notice. Every piece of the puzzle was snapping into place, and the picture was ugly. By 2 a.m., I had the voice recorder on the table in front of me, my phone beside it. If he wanted a war, I was done playing defense. The next day, I walked into that meeting with the senior partner armed with specifics. I explained my work history, provided references from past supervisors, and even offered to have them speak directly with my former colleagues. She nodded, making notes, but I could tell the shadow of those accusations still lingered. When I left the office, my phone buzzed with a text from my mom. Family dinner tonight. Be there if you can. Normally, I'd have skipped it. But if my stepfather was still running his mouth, I wanted to be in the room to hear it. And maybe, just maybe, to catch it on record. Dinner started innocently enough. But about halfway through, while my mom was in the kitchen, he leaned back in his chair and said to my uncle, "It's only a matter of time before they see what he's really like." I gave them a heads up. They'll thank me later. The recorder in my pocket was running. My heart pounded, but I kept my expression neutral. My uncle asked something I couldn't hear clearly, and my stepfather smirked. Let's just say, I made sure his first day is going to be his last. That was it. Proof. Not the whole story yet, but enough to show intent, enough to start turning this around. What I didn't know was that this recording would lead to a confrontation so public, it would leave him with nowhere to hide. I must have replayed that recording a dozen times that night. Every word was as clear as if he'd been sitting across from me again, smirking into his coffee. It was enough to prove intent, maybe even enough to embarrass him in front of the family. But in the professional world, it was shaky ground. The truth is, companies don't like drama. If I walked into my new job waving around an audio file of my stepfather trashing me, it wouldn't matter that it was true. They'd just see someone bringing personal baggage into the office. And if he found a way to spin it, I'd look like the unstable one. I needed more. Something that tied his lies directly to the firm. Proof that he'd gone beyond idle gossip and actively tried to sabotage my employment. The problem was, I had less than 48 hours before my start date. 48 hours to either secure my position or walk into an office full of people who'd been told I was poison. That night, I barely slept. Every plan I came up with fell apart as soon as I imagined him in front of my mom, shrugging and saying, "He's overreacting." She'd believe me, but the rest of the family? They'd write it off as another clash in our long history of not getting along. By the next morning, I was running on caffeine and stubbornness. I called Daniel, told him what I had, and asked if it was enough. He was quiet for a long moment. "It's a start," he said finally. "But you're right. It won't stick unless you catch him naming names. You need him to say the firm's name, the person he spoke to, and what he told them. That's the only way to close the loop. How do I get that without making him suspicious? I asked. You don't, Daniel said. You make him want to brag. You know how he is. Give him a chance to feel like the smartest guy in the room, and he'll hand you everything. That meant one thing. I had to walk straight into his territory, unarmed except for the recorder, and act like I didn't know a thing. The thought made my stomach knot. He was dangerous in conversation, not in a physical way, but in the way a seasoned manipulator is dangerous. He could twist your words back on you before you even realized you'd said them. Still, I didn't see another choice. If I didn't get that final piece, I'd be going into my first day with a target painted on my back. That evening, my mom invited me to a small get-together at their place. Normally, I'd have said no, but this time, I said yes without hesitation. She sounded surprised. When I arrived, he was already in the living room with two of his buddies, beer bottles sweating on the coffee table. He looked up, smirked, and said, "Well, if it isn't the company's newest golden boy." I smiled like I didn't hear the sarcasm, sat down, and let the conversation roll. All I had to do was wait for the moment he couldn't resist showing off. And when it came, it was so much worse, and so much better, than I'd hoped. It started innocently enough, just small talk about local politics, the rising cost of living, and someone's kid making the varsity team. But I could see it in his eyes. He was itching to bring up the job. I didn't rush him. I let his buddies keep drinking, laughing at bad jokes, loosening the atmosphere until the room felt like a private club where everyone was a little too comfortable. That's when he leaned back in his chair, took a slow sip of beer, and said, "You know, not everyone would have gotten that offer if I hadn't paved the way." I tilted my head, playing dumb. Paved the way? He grinned. The grin of a man who thinks he's about to deliver a masterclass in manipulation. Let's just say I had a conversation with the right people. Dropped a few truths about your work habits. Made them see the risk. His friend chuckled. "Wait, you're saying you tried to talk them out of hiring him?" He shrugged, feigning modesty. "I wouldn't put it like that. I just told them to be ready when he messed up. They know me over there. They'll call me in to clean up the mess." I leaned forward, keeping my voice light. "Which people did you talk to?" And just like that, he took the bait. "Linda, senior partner. We go way back." Told her exactly what she needed to know. The recorder in my pocket might as well have been glowing red hot. This was it, the final piece. He'd tied himself directly to the sabotage, named the firm, and admitted his intent. I could have waited until later to use it. But something in me, maybe years of being told I'd never measure up, decided this moment was too perfect to waste. So I pulled the recorder from my pocket, set it on the table, and pressed play. The room went still as his own voice filled the air. Let's just say, I made sure his first day is going to be his last. Followed by, "They'll thank me later." His buddies looked at him like they'd just seen a ghost. My mom, who had come in from the kitchen halfway through, froze in the doorway. "You recorded me?" he demanded, his face flushing deep red. "Yeah," I said, my voice steady. "Because I knew you wouldn't be able to help yourself. And now everyone here knows exactly what you've been doing." For a second, I thought he might actually try to spin it, claim it was a joke, or that I'd edited it. But the looks around the room told him the damage was already done. My mom stepped forward, her voice shaking. "Greg, you told me you were supporting him, that you wanted him to succeed." He opened his mouth, then closed it again. The silence was louder than any excuse he could have made. I stood, sliding the recorder back into my pocket. "Here's the thing," I said, looking him dead in the eye. "You don't get to decide whether I succeed. That's my call. And now it's clear to everyone here exactly what kind of man you are." Without waiting for a response, I walked out. Behind me, I heard the murmurs start, the kind that spread fast in families, the kind that stained reputations for years. And that was just the beginning of the fallout, because the firm was about to hear the recording too. The drive home that night felt different. The air seemed lighter, the streetlights sharper. I'd spent years carrying his voice in my head. Every insult, every dig, every quiet little reminder that I'd never amount to anything. And now, for the first time, I could feel that weight starting to crumble. The next morning, I emailed the firm's senior partner with a short, polite message. Following up on our recent conversation, I wanted to provide clarity regarding the concerns you mentioned. I believe the attached audio will speak for itself. I didn't add commentary. I didn't need to. The file said everything. 2 hours later, she called me. There was no small talk. I listened to it, she said. That's disturbing. I'm sorry you've had to deal with that. You should know it doesn't change our decision. You start Monday as planned. And for what it's worth, we'll be keeping our distance from Mr. Collins. That last part hit me harder than I expected. It wasn't just that they believed me. It was that they saw him for what he was. And that kind of exposure, in his small, carefully curated social circle, was going to sting far worse than anything I could say to his face. Word spread quickly. My uncle told my cousin, who told my stepbrother's girlfriend, who told, well, everyone. By the end of the week, my mom called to tell me he'd skipped 2 family dinners in a row. Said he's busy, she muttered, but I could hear the tension in her voice. She knew it wasn't work keeping him away, it was shame. At my new job, I poured every ounce of energy into proving myself. I stayed late, asked smart questions, and delivered results before anyone had to follow up. By the end of my first month, I'd landed a small but high-profile client, and the partners were already talking about expanding my role. Meanwhile, the stories about him started circling back to me. The community board he bragged about being part of, they quietly removed him from a leadership position. The senior partner he'd tried to sway, she told mutual acquaintances that she wouldn't trust him with a stapler, let alone a department. When I finally saw him again, a chance encounter at the grocery store, he couldn't look me in the eye. He muttered a flat, "Hey," and moved past me like I was just another stranger in the aisle. I didn't chase him down. I didn't need to. Because here's the thing about people like him. Their power only exists if you keep giving it to them. The moment you take it back, really take it back, they're just another loud voice in a quiet room. In the weeks that followed, I stopped replaying his old insults in my head. They didn't fit anymore. They belonged to someone else's version of me, the one who was still trying to earn his approval. Now, when I think about his favorite line, "You'll never amount to anything," it almost makes me laugh. Because the truth is, I didn't just amount to something. I amounted to exactly the kind of person he can't stand. Independent, successful, and completely out of his reach. And that's a promotion no one can take away.